The gate stood open against the late light, and Mara stood at the edge of the last street in Cinder Flats with her satchel at her feet and her hands empty, listening to the boarding house latch settle behind her like a verdict. She had been turned away from 3 doors that afternoon, and this was the 4th, and the woman behind her had not even let her finish the sentence about the room. There was a wariness in this town that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a woman alone on the road, and she knew the look of it the way she knew the look of a sick calf, from a distance, before it was ever spoken. She had come up the valley road on foot, 11 miles from the railhead at Dry Fork, because the fare had run out before the country did, and because she had learned long ago that a person can carry a great deal more than they think they can, if they have no choice about it. Her boots were worn through at the toe. Her coat had been a good one once, before the years and the weather had their way with it. And under her arm she carried the only thing she had not sold, a leather satchel with a cracked strap, and inside it the tools of a trade nobody in this town had any use for, or so they seemed to believe. On the road, an hour out of Dry Fork, a wagon had thrown a shoe and the driver had been standing in the dust cursing the horse, and Mara had stopped, because stopping was what she did, the way other people breathed. She had walked around the animal once, twice, watching the way it stood, the way it favored the off foreleg, the way its ears told her more than its feet did. She had knelt in the road and run her hand down the leg, and the man had watched her with his mouth half open, and she had said, "Quiet. It's not the shoe. It's the shoulder. He's been carrying a strain for a week." And she had shown him where to put his hand and how to work the muscle loose, and the horse had stepped forward sound, and the man had looked at her like she had pulled a coin from behind his ear. He had offered her a ride the rest of the way, and she had taken it, because a kindness offered freely is a rare thing, and she had learned not to waste one. But the town was different. The town had no use for a woman with a satchel and a story she would not tell, and the doors kept closing. She stood now where the buildings gave out and the road became a track running south across the flats, and she could see, a mile off, a ranch gate standing open against the dying light. It was the only gate on this side of the valley that was not shut. The others were latched and chained, the way a country that has had a hard year learns to keep its fences. But this one hung open, swinging a little in the wind, and there was something in the way it stood that made her stop. Behind her, a man came out of the mercantile and called to her, not unkindly, "You'll not find work in Cinder Flats, miss. You do better to keep walking south." She did not answer him. She stood a long moment looking at that open gate, and then she picked up her satchel and she walked toward it, because out of all the doors that had closed on her that day, this was the only one that was not shut, and she had a feeling about open things. She had walked half the distance when she saw the smoke. It was not chimney smoke, the clean gray thread of a hearth fire. It was a low, drifting, yellowish smoke coming off the far pasture, and Mara knew what that meant before she was close enough to smell it, and the knowing of it sat in her chest like a stone. She had seen that smoke before, on a ranch in another county, in another life, and she had never forgotten the smell of it, the way it got into a person's clothes and stayed. The gate was open because whoever owned this place had no time to shut it. They were too busy burning. She came up the lane, and there was a man in the yard with his back to her, a tall man in a canvas coat, standing with his hands on his hips looking out at the pasture where the smoke was, and he did not turn when she stopped at the edge of the yard. He stood the way a man stands when he has been standing a long time and has forgotten how to stop. She said, "You've got sick cattle." He turned then, slow, and looked at her, and she saw a face that had been through something, the kind of face that has gone past grief into a kind of flat tiredness, the way a man looks after he has been carrying something heavy for too long and has stopped feeling the weight of it. He looked at her satchel, and her worn coat, and her boots, and he said, "I've got dead cattle. The sick ones are the ones I haven't buried yet." "I can help you," she said. He looked at her a long moment, and she could see him weighing her, the way a man weighs a stranger, and she could see the tiredness in him deciding against her before the man in him could even speak. "I've had 2 hands quit this week," he said. "They said the place was cursed. You want to be the 3rd thing that walks off this land. You can turn around now and save us both the trouble." "I'm not walking off," she said. He looked at her again, and something in his face shifted, not much, but enough. "You know cattle?" "I know the one that's going to die before it dies," she said. "I know the one the herd will leave behind. I've spent my life going back for the ones nobody else would go back for." He was quiet a moment, and then he said, Then you've come to the wrong place, because that's all I've got left. The ones nobody would go back for. The wind moved across the yard, carrying the smell of the smoke, and Mara stood there with her satchel in her hand and the open gate behind her, and she knew, the way she knew a sick animal, that she had come to the one place in the valley that needed her, whether it knew it yet or not. Elias Barrow's ranch was called the Broken Spur, and it had been in his family for 40 years, and it was dying by inches. The house was a good house, built square and true, but the paint was going and the porch sagged in one corner, and the outbuildings had the look of things that had not been mended because there was no heart left in the mending. The herd was thin, the pasture was overgrazed, and in the far field, where the yellowish smoke hung low over the grass, the sick cattle stood apart from the healthy ones, heads down, the way cattle stand when they have given up. Mara did not ask permission to look. She walked past the house and out into the field, and Elias followed her, not because he trusted her, but because he had nothing left to lose by watching. She walked among the cattle slowly, and she did not touch them, not at first. She watched. She watched the way they stood, the way they breathed, the way their eyes moved, the way a cow that is sick will stand apart, and a cow that is dying will not even lift its head. She found the first one down in the grass, a young heifer, and she knelt beside it and ran her hand over its flank, and she felt the heat of it, and she looked at its eyes, and she said, quiet, "How long have they been like this?" "A week," Elias said. "Maybe more. I thought it was the water at first. Then I thought it was the feed. I've done everything I know to do, and they keep dying." "It's not the water," she said. "It's not the feed." She stood up and looked out across the field, and she was quiet a long moment, and then she said, "It's the salt." He stared at her. "The salt. There's a patch of ground over there," she said, pointing to a low, wet-looking place at the far edge of the pasture. "That's where they're getting sick. There's something in that ground. I've seen it before, on a ranch down near the river. There's a mineral in the soil, and when the cattle lick it, it poisons them slow. You've got to move them off that ground, and you've got to do it tonight, or you'll lose the whole herd." Elias looked at her, and she could see the doubt in him, the tiredness, the part of him that had been disappointed so many times that he did not know how to believe a stranger. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. "I've seen a herd die this way. I've seen the ones that live and the ones that don't. You move them off that ground and give them clean water and clean salt, and most of them will come back. The ones that are already down, you can't save, but the ones that are standing, you can." He was quiet a long moment, and then he said, "Why would you help me? You don't know me. You walked up my lane an hour ago." She looked at him, and she said, "Because the gate was open." He did not understand her, and she did not explain, and that was the first thing she liked about him, that he did not press. They worked until dark, moving the herd off the poisoned ground, and Mara showed his two remaining hands how to tell the sick ones from the dying ones, how to look at an animal and know which one would live. The hands were wary of her at first, a woman telling them their business, but she did not tell them their business. She showed them, and she let them do the work, and by the time the sun went down there was a change in the way they looked at her, not trust exactly, but something that could grow into it. That night she sat at the kitchen table with Elias, eating the stew he had warmed, and he asked her, careful, "Where are you from?" She was quiet a moment, and then she said, "I'm from a place that doesn't exist anymore." He did not ask what that meant. He just nodded, and they ate in the quiet, and the wind came up outside and rattled the window, and Mara thought about the open gate, and about how a person can be turned away from 100 doors and still find the one that is not shut. The next morning the sickness was worse. 3 more cattle were down, and the ones that had been standing the day before were standing less. Elias stood in the yard with his hands on his hips, looking at the field, and the tiredness in him was back, deeper than before. "I did what you said," he said. "They're off the ground. They've got clean water, and they're still dying." "It takes time," Mara said. "You can't undo a week of poison in a day. The ones that are going to live will live. You just have to give them the time." "I don't have time," he said. "The bank note comes due in 10 days. Silas Vane holds it, and Silas Vane has been wanting this land for years, and he's going to get it now, because I can't pay him and I can't sell him a herd that's dying." She looked at him. "Silas Vane," she said. "You know him?" "I know the name," she said. "I know the kind of man who holds a note and waits for the day it comes due. I've known a few of them in my life." Elias looked at her, and there was something in his face that she could not read, and he said, "You've known a lot of things, for a woman who won't say where she's from." She was quiet a moment, and then she said, "I've known what it is to have everything taken from you by a man who thought he had the right. That's where I'm from." The words hung in the air between them, and Elias did not answer. And there was a long silence that was not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that happens between two people who have both been through something and do not need to explain it to each other. The hands came in from the field at noon, and the older one, a man named Gus, took off his hat and stood in the doorway, and he said, "She's right about the ground. I found a dead one this morning, down in that low place, and it had been licking at the dirt. I've never seen a cow do that unless something was wrong with it." Elias looked at Mara, and there was something new in his face, something that had not been there before, and he said, "You were right." "I know," she said. And she said it without pride, the way a person states a fact they have known for a long time, and Elias almost smiled, the first time she had seen him almost smile, and it changed his face entirely. But that afternoon, Silas Vane came up the lane. He came in a good buggy with a good horse, and he stepped down into the yard like a man who owns the ground he stands on, which he was about to. And he looked at the house and the outbuildings and the thin herd with the practiced eye of a man who has taken 100 ranches and knows the look of one that is about to fall. He was a smooth man, unhurried, with a voice like oil, and he did not look at Mara at all, not at first, the way a man does not look at a piece of furniture. "Elias," he said, warm, as if they were old friends. "I came to see if you'd come to your senses." "I've come to my senses," Elias said. "I'm not selling." Silas Vane smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "You're not selling," he said. "You're losing. There's a difference, and the difference is the note that comes due in 10 days. You can't pay it. I know you can't pay it, because I know what your herd is worth, which is nothing, because it's dying. So you can sell me the land now, for a fair price, and walk away with something in your pocket, or you can lose it in 10 days and walk away with nothing. Those are your choices, Elias. I'm giving you a kindness by offering them to you." Elias stood in the yard with his hands at his sides, and Mara watched him, and she saw the tiredness in him fighting with something else, something that had been buried so deep she had not seen it until now. And she stepped forward, and she said, "Quiet. The herd's not dying." Silas Vane turned and looked at her then, and there was a flicker of something in his face, surprise, and then dismissal, the way a man dismisses a thing he does not consider worth his attention. "And you are someone who knows cattle," she said. "The herd's not dying. It was poisoned by the ground, and it's been moved off the ground, and it's going to recover. You're a week early for your foreclosure, Mr. Vane." Silas Vane looked at her a long moment, and then he looked at Elias, and he smiled again, and it was not a kind smile. "You're taking advice from a woman who walked up your lane yesterday," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know about the state of this place." He climbed back into his buggy, and he looked down at them, and he said, 10 days, Elias. I'll be back in 10 days, and I'll bring the papers." He drove off down the lane, and the dust settled, and Elias stood in the yard with his hands at his sides, and he said, "He's right. I can't pay the note. Even if the herd recovers, I can't pay it in 10 days. I've been running this place on borrowed time and borrowed money for 2 years, and the time is up." Mara looked at him, and she said, "How much is the note?" He told her, and she was quiet a moment, and then she said, "That's a lot of money." "It's everything," he said. "It's the difference between this place and nothing." She looked out across the field, at the cattle standing with their heads down, and she said, "Then we'd better make the herd worth it." And she turned and walked out into the field, and Elias watched her go, and he did not know yet what she was planning, but he knew, the way a man knows a thing before it is spoken, that she was not going to let this place fall. The storm came on the 3rd day. It came down out of the mountains in the afternoon, a hard, driving rain that turned the yard to mud and the field to a bog, and the wind came with it, and the temperature dropped, and by nightfall the cattle were standing in the cold and the wet with their heads down, and the ones that had been recovering began to sicken again. Mara stood in the barn door watching the rain come down, and she knew what the cold and the wet would do to a herd that was already weak, and she knew that if she did not do something, everything they had gained in 3 days would be lost by morning. She went to Elias. "We've got to get them in," she said. "All of them. The ones that are standing, the ones that are down. We've got to get them under cover and dry, or we lose them. There's not enough room, he said. The barn holds 30. I've got 60. Then we build, she said. We take down the fence rails, and we build a lean-to against the barn, and we get them all under it. It's not much, but it's dry, and dry is what they need. They worked through the night, she and Elias and Gus and the other hand, a boy named Will, and the rain came down and the wind tore at them, and they moved the cattle in the dark, calling to them, guiding them with lantern light and their own bodies, and the cattle came, tired and sick and trusting, the way cattle trust a person who has been kind to them. And Mara worked among them, checking each one, feeling for the heat of fever, listening to the way they breathed, and she did not stop, and she did not complain, and she worked the way she had worked her whole life, quietly, steadily, going back for the ones nobody else would go back for. It was near dawn when she found the calf. It was a small thing, a few weeks old, and it was down in the mud at the edge of the lean-to, too weak to get up, and the rain was beating on it, and Mara knelt in the mud beside it, and she lifted it, and it was so light in her arms, so thin. And she carried it into the barn, and she wrapped it in a blanket, and she held it, and she talked to it. Lo, the way you talk to a thing that is dying, not because you think it will live, but because you cannot stand to let it die alone. Elias came into the barn, and he saw her there, holding the calf, and he stopped, and he watched her a long moment. And then he came, and he knelt beside her, and he said, "Is it going to make it?" "I don't know," she said. "It's been out in the cold too long, but I'm not going to give up on it." He was quiet a moment, and then he said, "Why?" She looked at him, and her eyes were tired, and she said, "Because somebody has to go back for it. That's the whole of it. That's the whole of everything, I think. Somebody has to go back for the one the herd would leave behind." The rain beat on the roof of the barn, and the calf shivered in her arms, and Elias looked at her, and there was something in his face that had not been there before, something that had been buried for a long time and was beginning to surface. And he said, quiet, "My wife died 3 years ago, and my son, a year after that. He was 21. He went out to check the fence line in a storm like this, and he never came back, and I've been standing in this yard ever since, waiting for something to make it worth standing in." Mara was quiet a long moment, holding the calf, and the rain came down, and she said, "I had a husband. He was a good man, and his brother took everything we had, the ranch, the money, the name, and he did it with papers and lawyers and a smile, the way men like that do, and he told me I was nothing, that I was a burden, that I had never been anything but a burden, and I believed him for a long time. And then one day I stopped believing him, and I walked out, and I've been walking ever since, looking for a place where the door would stay open." The rain came down, and the calf shivered, and Elias reached out, and he put his hand on her arm, and he said, "You're not a burden." She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes, and she said, "I know that now. It took me a long time to know it, but I know it." And the calf, in her arms, made a small sound, and she looked down at it, and it was still alive, and she held it closer, and the rain came down on the roof, and something between them had changed, quietly, in the dark of the barn, the way a thing changes when two people who have been through something finally tell each other the truth of it. The storm broke the next morning, and the sun came out, and the valley was green and washed and new, and the cattle stood in the lean-to, heads up, and the ones that had been sick were standing, and the ones that had been down were getting up, and Mara walked among them in the morning light, and she checked each one, and they were recovering. The herd was going to live. Silas Vane came back on the 10th day. He came up the lane in his good buggy, and he stepped down into the yard, and he had the papers in his hand, and he looked at the house and the outbuildings and the herd, and he saw the cattle standing in the field, healthy, heads up, and something in his face flickered, and he said, "You've got a herd." "I've got a herd," Elias said. Silas Vane looked at the cattle a long moment, and then he said, "That's a good herd. That's a valuable herd." "It is," Elias said, "and I've got the money to pay the note. I've got a buyer for the yearlings, and I've got the money in the bank, and I'm going to pay you what I owe you, in full today." Silas Vane stood in the yard, and the papers hung in his hand, and he looked at Elias, and then he looked at Mara, who was standing at the edge of the yard, and he looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that she had seen before, the look of a man who has been sure of a thing and has been proven wrong, and does not know what to do with the wrongness of it. "You did this," he said to her. "You saved this place." "I helped," she said. The herd was worth saving. Silas Vane was quiet a long moment, and then he folded the papers, and he put them in his pocket, and he said, "I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I think I've been most wrong about you." And he looked at her, and there was no mockery in his voice, only a kind of tired honesty, and he said, "I didn't think a woman alone could do what you've done. I was wrong. I'll take my money and I'll go, and I won't trouble this place again." He took the money, and he drove off down the lane, and the dust settled, and Elias stood in the yard and watched him go, and he said, "He's never going to trouble us again." "No," Mara said. "He's not. He's a man who knows when he's been beaten, and he knows it wasn't me that beat him. It was the truth of the thing. The herd lived. That's all it was. The herd lived, and everything he built his claim on was gone." The hands came out of the barn, and Gus took off his hat, and he looked at Mara, and he said, "Ma'am, I've worked this land for 20 years, and I've never seen a herd saved the way you saved this one. I want you to know, if you ever need anything, you've got a friend on this place." And Will, the boy, nodded, and said, "Me too." And Mara stood in the yard in the morning light, and she looked at the ranch, at the house and the barn and the herd standing in the field, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, a kind of belonging, a kind of being wanted, and she did not know what to do with it, because she had been turned away from so many doors that she had forgotten what it felt like to be let in. That evening, she sat on the porch with Elias, watching the sun go down over the valley, and the calf she had carried out of the rain was standing in the yard, wobbling on its legs, and it came over to the porch and nuzzled her hand, and she laughed, a small, surprised sound, and Elias looked at her, and he said, "You gave that calf a name?" "Not yet," she said. "I'm waiting to see what it turns out to be." He was quiet a moment, and then he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the door staying open. I want you to know, this door stays open, for as long as you want it to. This is your place now, if you'll have it. Not because you saved the herd, but because of who you are." She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes, and she said, "I've been turned away from a lot of doors. I stopped expecting any of them to stay open. I think I'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted somewhere." "Then let me remind you," he said. "Stay? That's all I'm asking. Stay." And she sat there on the porch with the sun going down and the calf at her feet, and the valley green and quiet before her, and she thought about all the doors that had closed on her, and about this one, the only one that had opened, and she said, quiet, "Out of all the doors in the world, this is the one I walked through. I think I'll stay a while." The years went by the way years go by on a ranch, in seasons, in work, in the slow turning of the land. The broken spur grew strong again, and the herd grew, and the house got its paint, and the porch got its mending, and the valley came to know Mara not as the stranger who had walked up the lane, but as the woman who had saved the place, and who had saved more than the place, though nobody said it aloud. She and Elias were married in the spring, in the yard, with the hands standing around and the calf, grown now into a fine cow, standing at the edge of the gathering like she had a right to be there. And the town, which had once turned her away from every door, came to the wedding, and the women who had shut their doors on her brought pies, and the men who had told her to keep walking shook her hand, and she stood in the yard in the spring light, and she thought about how a person can be turned away from 100 doors and still find the one that was always going to open. And on a quiet evening, years later, she stood at the ranch gate, the same gate that had stood open the day she walked through it, and she looked down the lane, and she thought about the girl she had been, the woman with the worn coat and the cracked satchel and the empty hands, and she thought about how far she had come, and how the thing that had saved her was not the ranch, and not the herd, and not even the man who had asked her to stay. It was the thing she had carried her whole life, the thing the world had told her was nothing, the thing she had learned to believe in again. It was the going back. It was the going back for the ones nobody else would go back for. And she stood at the gate in the evening light, and she put her hand on the post, and she said, quiet, to no one and to everyone, worth doesn't need to be announced. It just needs one door to stay open long enough to be seen. And the gate stood open, and the valley was green, and the herd was home, and the man she loved came up the lane and put his hand on hers, and they stood together at the gate, and the sun went down over the broken spur, and the world was quiet and whole, and there was nothing left to be afraid of, and nothing left to prove. And if you're listening tonight, wherever you are, I want you to know that this story is for you. It's for the ones who have been turned away from a door or two, who have been told they were too much or not enough, who have carried something heavy for a long time and wondered if anyone would ever go back for them. If that's you, I hope you know that you are worth going back for. And if this story felt like a warm place to rest tonight, I'd be honored if you'd leave a like and a subscribe so we can keep telling these stories together for the ones who need to hear that the door stays open. Because next time, I want to tell you about a woman who found a letter in a wall of an old house, a letter that had been waiting 30 years for someone to read it, and about the secret it held, and about the man who had been carrying that secret his whole life without knowing he was carrying it. It's a story about the things we leave behind and the things that find us anyway, and I think you're going to want to hear it. Until then, be good to yourselves and be good to each other, and remember, the door stays open.